Hey WondrBolt builders, in today's video we're going to look over how to use some of the different parts of the WondrBolt Inventor Kit. So we've got the large gear and the small gear. We've got two of the paper tube holders here. We've got a handle, a crank handle. We've got two rotation anchors. And we have some sleeve nuts and some slip rings. And so I'm going to go over all of these pieces and show you how they work together. Alright, so let's get started. So let's start with the gears first, and I'll explain to you how these work. So the large gear has 40 teeth, and the small gear has 20 teeth. So the small gear is exactly half the size of the larger gear. So let's connect these gears together and let's see how they work. So I've made a hole over here to connect the larger gear. You'll notice when trying to assemble this that the WondrBolt doesn't fit perfectly within the space provided in the middle of the gear. And the reason for that is you need to decide whether you're going to use a sleeve nut or a slip ring in the center of the gear. If you use a sleeve nut, what that does is it secures the bolt into the gear. So when you put them together, the bolt and the gear move as one piece. Okay. Now if instead of using the sleeve nut, if we use the slip ring, and then put the bolt through, then the gear is able to spin freely along the bolt. So you have to decide as you're building which one of these two options you want to use, the slip ring or the sleeve nut. The sleeve nut secures the bolt and the gear together, and the slip ring allows the gear to rotate freely along the bolt. So in this case, I'm going to use the sleeve nut, put that through there, and I'm going to put the bolt through on this side. And I'm going to put the gear over here. Now I've attached the bolt to the gear, so as the gear turns, the bolt turns. Now let's say I want to connect the smaller gear into this assembly. What we can do is grab the slip ring and put it together against the larger gear, and then take the palm stop and put that underneath. Hold the small gear against the larger gear, and you can punch a hole through this way. So now you've made a hole exactly where you need to connect these two gears together. Now let's finish that up by putting in another long bolt. And let's close that off. Alright. So what we have now is a large gear connected to a smaller gear. The small gear is using a slip ring to connect to the bolt, and the large gear is using a sleeve nut. So if I grab a hold of the WondrBolt here and start spinning it, you'll notice just turning the shaft, turning this bolt, will turn the entire gear over here. But you'll also notice that the smaller gear rotates freely along the WondrBolt there. If we had used a sleeve nut here, then turning this gear would also turn this bolt. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, you might use one or the other. In this case, I used a sleeve nut for this and a slip ring for this one. Now the other problem is turning it like this is kind of hard, so we might want to use a crank handle. So let's add a crank handle assembly in here. We're going to take out the bolt from the big gear, and I want to connect the crank handle and the big gear together so I can crank the gear with the handle. So the best way to use the crank handle, you can see here that one side is flat and one side is indented a little bit like this. So the side that's indented like this is always going to be the side that you place against the cardboard. You don't want to place the flat side against the cardboard, you always want to place the indented side against the cardboard. And you'll see why in just a moment. So I'm going to connect the WondrBolt to this crank handle using a sleeve nut, like that. I'm going to put the bolt through this. So notice that the sleeve nut goes in from the flat side. And then I'm going to place this through the hole where it was before. And you can see now why I wanted to use it this way, because now we have a little bit of space over here to put a handle onto this crank. Next we're going to put the gear on. There we go. And we probably should close off the gear as well. Just like that. And now if we flip on this side, what I can do I can put a handle onto this. So I can go in here and actually put a long WondrBolt handle on here. And just to make sure it stays in place, I'm going to put a nut here as well. There we go. So now you can see that I can grab this and turn the gear. So by turning the handle like this, I'm turning the gear. So this is how the gears can work. Alright, so we're going to add a few more parts to this now. First part we're going to add in is the paper tube holder. So the way the paper tube holder works is if you have a paper tube like this, the first thing you're going to do is take one of these bands and you're going to try to push it around the paper tube. Don't worry if you bend the paper tube a little bit, that's okay. There we go. So we've got the band now on the paper tube. Now I'm going to place the holder into the paper tube like that. And then the last step is to pull the band back against the holder. And so now the paper tube is basically squeezed between the band and the paper tube holder. That's what keeps it in place. The next step is to choose whether to put a slip ring or a sleeve nut in here. So I'm going to put in a sleeve nut. There we go. So now you can attach this paper tube to either of these two shafts. If I attach it to the larger gear, for example, then turning the crank will turn the paper tube. Just so you can see this a bit more clearly, I'm going to draw some lines in the paper tube here. It'll be easier for you to see the rotation now. Now on the other hand, if I take off the paper tube from here and I put it onto this bolt, remember this bolt is connected to the gear with a slip ring, not a sleeve nut. And the slip ring allows the gear to rotate freely along the bolt. If I connect this here now and I turn the crank, the paper tube doesn't turn. That's because the gear is turning, but it's not forcing the WondrBolt to turn. If I were to rebuild this, and if I were to take out the small gear, and instead of using a slip ring, if I were to use a sleeve nut, like this, and if I connect this back to the bolt now, and let's close it off, and connect the paper tube to that. Now what's happening is I'm forcing that WondrBolt to turn as well, which in turn is causing the paper tube to turn as well. Now let's say you wanted to turn something else. Let's take the paper tube off. And let's say you were interested in turning another piece of cardboard completely. So how would you connect, for example, this piece of cardboard to this gear system and allow it to rotate as you turn the crank? So that's where these rotation anchors come in play. A rotation anchor will allow you to rotate a flat piece of cardboard along with the gears. So what we can do here is we'll take the sleeve nut out of the paper tube roll and we'll put it into the rotation anchor. Alright, and then what we can do here is connect the rotation anchor to this piece of cardboard. So let's put it like this. Make the first hole. Let's put that in place. And we'll make the second hole. And connect this. Alright, so now we've got the rotation anchor connected to a piece of cardboard. We can now take this cardboard and fit it onto that WondrBolt. So now when I turn the crank, it turns the entire cardboard. Now you'll notice for every turn of the crank I make, the cardboard spins twice. Watch this. So I'm going to start on this side. We're going to do it like this. So one turn and another turn. One turn and another turn. And the reason why the cardboard spins twice is because my crank is connected to the large gear, which has 40 teeth. And the small gear is what was connected to the cardboard, which has 20 teeth. So when I turn the larger gear, it causes the small gear to turn twice, because the small gear has to turn twice for every rotation of the larger gear. So if you have a project where you need to make something spin very fast, this would be a good configuration where you connect the crank handle to the larger gear. On the other hand, if you want something to spin slower, you could connect the crank handle to the smaller gear. If you connected the crank handle to the small gear, you would have to do 2 full circles for every circle that the larger gear turned. So let's say, for example, we connected the cardboard to the larger gear, 2 full circles of the crank handle on the small gear would cause the larger gear and the cardboard to only turn once. Okay, so now there's one more thing to talk about, and that's all these extra little holes in the large gear. So these holes are intended to allow you to create something with linear motion, a reciprocating linear motion actually. So something that you'd see, for example, on a train. So if you've looked at train wheels, they have those bars that go across the wheels that go back and forth, back and forth. And that's what you can do with the large gear. So let's give that a try. I'm going to get rid of the small gear. And we're going to flip this assembly around. So I'm going to put the bolt through on this side, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab another bolt and we'll put it through this way. Okay, so I've got one bolt going through in one direction through the middle and another bolt going through one of the holes in the other direction. And now I'm going to place this back onto the cardboard and we're going to connect this here. So the crank handle is assembled again. The next step is I'm going to put one of these nuts into the bolt to keep it in place. There we go. And let's connect a piece of cardboard, let's connect a cardboard strip to it. So we're going to connect this cardboard strip to that bolt. We'll close that off here. All right. So now what we've got is we've got a crank handle connected to a gear, and off center from the gear we've connected a piece of cardboard. So for example now, if I were to hold this cardboard in my hand, you can see how the gear is now pushing the cardboard back and forth. So in one direction it's pushed it forward, and as the gear turns back the other direction it pulls it back, and pushes it forward and pulls it back. So this is called a reciprocating motion. And this is also something you can do with the large gear in WondrBolts. Alright, so the Inventor Kit has a number of different parts that you can use in a variety of ways. Some of the ways I've shown you now are kind of the basic ways you can use them, but there's really a lot of different ways you can experiment with to come up with different types of motion and build different kinds of machines. For example, in this case, you could build a model train that actually has a real reciprocating motion on the wheels. You could use the paper tube holders to build a winch where you can crank it and wind up some rope. So maybe you'll use that to raise and lower a drawbridge, for example, in a fort. You could use the rotation anchors if you wanted to create a windmill, for example, where you have these pieces that are turning in the wind. So there's a lot of different things you can do with these WondrBolt pieces. I hope you all have a lot of fun building with them. And always be sure to send us some pictures of the cool constructions you make. Post pictures on our Facebook page or on our Instagram for a chance to win some awesome monthly prizes. Alright, that's it for this video. Thanks everyone. Now it's time to get off the couch and go build something.